Billionaire switched to Japanese with a clause, Black Waitress translated, and the merger Flippedia story of hidden power, unexpected allies. And the courage to speak, the 63rd floor of the Apex Tower in Manhattan was a world unto itself. Suspended between earth and sky, where glass walls reflected clouds and ambition in equal measure. Inside Conference Room A, the air was thick with tension, expensive cologne, and the faint aroma of imported coffee. 6 men in tailored suits sat around a massive mahogany table that gleamed like a mirror, their faces masks of calculated composure. This was where empires were built and destroyed, where handshakes sealed fates and where silence often spoke louder than words. Today, the fate of 2 giant corporations hung in the balance, and everyone in that room knew that billions of dollars would shift hands before the sun set over the Hudson River. Marcus Chen sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as broken glass. At 48 years old, he had built Chen Technologies from a small software startup in his garage into a global powerhouse worth $30 billion. His black hair was streaked with distinguished gray at the temples, and his custom-fitted navy suit probably cost more than most people earned in 6 months. He had the kind of face that revealed nothing, a skill he had perfected over decades of negotiating with people who would smile while sliding a knife between your ribs. Today, he was meeting with the executives of Worldwide Communications, a company he intended to acquire, absorb, and strip for parts. The merger would make him even richer and more powerful, but more importantly, it would crush his biggest rival, David Brennan, who sat 3 seats to his left with barely concealed contempt in his pale blue eyes. David Brennan was old money, a 52-year-old titan of industry who had inherited his father's telecommunications empire and tripled its value through ruthless expansion and aggressive buyouts. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit immaculate, and his smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. He and Marcus had been circling each other like sharks for 5 years, each one trying to outmaneuver the other in the cutthroat world of tech and communications. This merger was supposed to be neutral ground, a partnership that would benefit both men equally, but everyone in the room understood that nothing was ever truly equal when billions were at stake. Someone would win and someone would lose, and the loser would be swallowed whole. The other 4 men at the table were lawyers, financial advisors, and company representatives. Each one paid enormous sums to protect their clients' interests. They shuffled papers, whispered among themselves, and typed notes on tablets with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that every word mattered. The negotiations had been going on for 3 hours, and everyone was exhausted, caffeinated, and on edge. The deal was 90% complete, but it was that final 10% where fortunes were won or lost, where clever wording in a contract could shift millions of dollars from one column to another, where a single clause could change everything. Near the back of the room, almost invisible against the dark wooden walls, stood Naomi Rivers. She was 28 years old, slender and graceful, with deep brown skin and intelligent dark eyes that most people never bothered to look into. She wore the standard uniform of the Apex Tower catering staff, a crisp white button-down shirt, black slacks, and sensible shoes that let her move silently across the plush carpet. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with quiet dignity that came from years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. She had been refilling coffee cups, removing empty pastry plates, and essentially being invisible for the past 3 hours, which was exactly what people expected from someone in her position. What none of these powerful men knew, what they couldn't have guessed even if they had bothered to notice her at all, was that Naomi Rivers had graduated summa cum laude from Columbia University with degrees in international business and linguistics. She spoke 5 languages fluently: English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, and Japanese. She had spent 2 years working in Tokyo for a consulting firm before her mother became ill, and she had to return to New York to care for her. The medical bills had been catastrophic, wiping out her savings and forcing her to take whatever work she could find while her mother underwent treatment. For the past 8 months, she had been serving coffee to billionaires who never once looked at her face, never once wondered if she might be anything more than a woman in a service uniform. Naomi had listened to every word spoken in that conference room for 3 hours. She understood the structure of the deal, the competing interests, the barely hidden hostility between Marcus Chen and David Brennan. She had seen this dynamic before in Tokyo, had watched powerful men play games with other people's livelihoods while treating service staff like furniture. She had trained herself not to react, not to show any emotion, to simply do her job and collect her paycheck because that paycheck kept her mother's medical treatments going. But today, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen, and Naomi's instincts, honed by years of navigating corporate environments, told her to pay very close attention. Marcus Chen leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The contract was almost finalized. The merger would be announced tomorrow, and the stock prices would explode. But Marcus had one final card to play, one clever maneuver that would tilt the entire deal in his favor at the last possible moment. He had spent weeks planning this, working with his lawyers to craft language so subtle that it would slip past the other side's review until it was too late to change. The clause was buried in Section 47, Paragraph 12, Subpoint C of the contract, hidden among hundreds of pages of legal terminology and technical specifications. It would give him controlling interest in 3 key patents that were currently owned by Worldwide Communications, patents worth billions in licensing fees over the next decade. David Brennan and his team had missed it during their review, distracted by larger numbers and more obvious negotiating points. And now Marcus was ready to seal the deal before anyone realized what had happened. But there was a problem. One of David's lawyers, a sharp young woman named Catherine Walsh, had started to look suspicious. She kept flipping back to Section 47, her brow furrowed, her pen tapping against her notepad. Marcus could see her mind working, see her starting to piece together what the clause actually meant. If she had another 10 minutes, she would figure it out, and the entire deal would collapse as David's team demanded renegotiation. Marcus needed to move fast, needed to get signatures on the contract before Catherine could sound the alarm. And he had prepared for exactly this scenario. Marcus cleared his throat and addressed the room in his smooth, confident voice. "Gentlemen, I think we've covered everything. The terms are fair, the structure is solid, and both our companies will benefit enormously from this partnership. I propose we sign the final documents now and announce the merger tomorrow morning." He pushed the contract across the table toward David Brennan with a gesture that suggested the matter was settled, that any further discussion would be insulting and unnecessary. David reached for his pen, but Catherine Walsh put her hand on his arm, stopping him. "Mr. Brennan, I'd like a few more minutes to review Section 47. Something doesn't look quite right." Her voice was professional but firm, and Marcus felt his jaw tighten. This was exactly what he had feared. He needed to shut this down immediately before she could explain her concerns to David. Marcus switched tactics, his expression becoming serious and slightly offended. "Catherine, we've been over that section 3 times. My legal team and your legal team have both approved the language. Are you suggesting there's some kind of problem?" His tone implied that questioning the contract now was both paranoid and unprofessional, a breach of negotiating etiquette that could derail the entire deal. Catherine hesitated, glancing at the pages again. She clearly sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite articulate what it was. The legal language was dense and technical, deliberately obscure in the way that contracts often are. "I just want to make sure we're not missing anything," she said, but her confidence was wavering under Marcus's steady gaze and the impatient looks from the other men at the table. This was Marcus's moment. He took a deep breath and then did something completely unexpected. He began speaking in rapid, flawless Japanese, addressing his own lawyer with what sounded like a casual question, but was actually a carefully rehearsed performance. "Tanaka-san, 私たちはこの契約の第47条に特別な条項を含めましたね。この条項は Worldwide Communications の3つのパテントトークに 5G 通信技術に関するパテントの完全な権利を私たちに移転させます。ブレナンさんと彼のチームはこの意味を理解していないようですが、これは全く問題ありません。 彼らが署名した、あと我々がそのパテントを完全にコントロールできます。これは10億ドルの価値があります。The words flowed smoothly, conversationally, as if Marcus were simply clarifying a minor technical point with his Japanese-American lawyer, James Tanaka, who sat beside him. But what Marcus had actually said, what he believed no one else in the room could possibly understand, was this. Tanaka, we've included a special clause in Section 47 of this contract, haven't we? This clause will transfer complete rights to 3 patents owned by Worldwide. Communications to us, specifically patents related to 5G communication technology. Mr. Brennan and his team don't seem to understand the implications, but that's perfectly fine. Once they sign, we'll have complete control of those patents. They're worth billions of dollars. James Tanaka nodded and responded in Japanese, playing his part perfectly. Hai Chen-san, sono tori desu. Karera wa ki ga tsukanai deshu. Yes, Mr. Chen, that's correct. They won't notice. Around the table, the English-speaking executives looked confused and slightly annoyed. Speaking in a foreign language during a business negotiation was unusual and somewhat rude, but not technically against any rules. David Brennan frowned and said, Marcus, what are you discussing? This is supposed to be a transparent process. Marcus held up his hands in a placating gesture, his expression innocent and apologetic. My apologies, David. I was simply confirming some technical details with Tanaka about the patent transfer protocols. Nothing that affects the deal structure, just implementation logistics that we'll handle after the signing. His voice was smooth as silk, reassuring and dismissive at the same time. Everything is exactly as we discussed. I give you my word, smirks appeared on the faces of Marcus's team. They knew exactly what had just happened. The trap had been set, the prey had been distracted, and now all that remained was to get the signatures before anyone realized they had been outmaneuvered. Marcus pushed the contract closer to David, picked up an expensive fountain pen, and extended it across the table with a smile. Shall we make history? David Brennan reached for the pen. Catherine Walsh had been distracted by the Japanese conversation and was now flipping through her notes, trying to remember what had bothered her about Section 47. The moment was slipping away from her. In another 30 seconds, David would sign, and the deal would be done. Marcus felt triumph rising in his chest like champagne bubbles. He had done it. He had won, and then a voice spoke from the back of the room, clear and sharp as breaking ice. Excuse me. Everyone turned. Naomi Rivers had stepped forward from her position against the wall, the empty coffee pot still in her hand. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her voice was steady and her eyes were locked on Marcus Chen. She had spent 3 hours being invisible, but she was done being invisible now. She had heard what Marcus said in Japanese, understood every single word, and she knew exactly what it meant. These men were about to make a decision based on deception, and while she owed them nothing, while they had never once shown her basic human courtesy, she couldn't stand by and watch them be cheated. Not when she had the power to stop it. I'm sorry to interrupt, Naomi continued, her voice growing stronger, but I speak Japanese, and I understood what Mr. Chen just said. The room fell completely silent. Every eye was on her now, these powerful men suddenly forced to actually see the woman who had been serving them coffee. He told his lawyer that Section 47 contains a hidden clause that transfers complete control of 3 5G communication patents from Worldwide Communications to Chen Technologies once the contract is signed. He said those patents are worth billions of dollars. He said you wouldn't notice. The words landed like grenades. David Brennan's face went from confused to shocked to furious in the space of 3 seconds. Catherine Walsh grabbed the contract and started flipping frantically to Section 47, her earlier suspicions now confirmed and amplified. The other executives erupted in overlapping voices, everyone talking at once, demanding explanations, looking between Marcus and Naomi in complete disbelief. Marcus Chen's face had gone white, then red. He stared at Naomi as if she had materialized out of thin air, as if the laws of physics had suddenly reversed and gravity was pulling upward instead of down. His mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to speak. That's not what I said. This woman is lying. She's trying to sabotage this deal for some reason." But James Tanaka had gone pale too, and his expression of guilt was confirmation enough. David Brennan slammed his hand on the table with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle. "Is this true, Marcus? Did you actually try to slip a clause past us? Did you think we were stupid enough not to eventually figure it out?" Catherine Walsh looked up from the contract, her face flushed with anger and vindication. "It's here. It's exactly as she said. Section 47, paragraph 12, subpoint C. The language is deliberately obscure, but it absolutely transfers the 5G patents to Chen Technologies. Those patents generate approximately $200 million in licensing revenue per year. Over a decade, we're talking about billions." She looked at David with barely controlled fury. "If you had signed this, we would have given away one of our most valuable assets." The room exploded again. David's lawyers were shouting about fraud and misrepresentation. Marcus's team was trying to argue that it was simply aggressive negotiation, that everyone should calm down and discuss this rationally. David himself had stood up, his face carved from granite, and pointed at Marcus with a shaking finger. "This deal is dead. Not just dead, cremated. You tried to cheat me, Marcus. You tried to steal from my company and smile in my face while you did it. We're done. And I'm going to make sure everyone in this industry knows exactly what kind of businessman you are." Marcus was on his feet too now, his composure completely shattered. "You can't prove intent. The clause was in the contract for everyone to see. If your lawyers missed it, that's your problem, not mine." But even as he argued, he knew it was over. The merger was dead, his reputation was damaged, and worse, far worse, he had been exposed by a waitress. A woman he had never looked at, never considered, never imagined could possibly affect his world. The humiliation burned hotter than the financial loss. David Brennan gathered his documents and his team, preparing to storm out of the conference room. But before he left, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked over to where Naomi still stood, her hand trembling now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and extended his hand to her. "Thank you," he said simply. "You just saved my company hundreds of millions of dollars." "What's your name?" "Naomi Rivers," she said quietly, shaking his hand. Her mind was racing, wondering if she had just gotten herself fired, wondering what would happen now, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by speaking up. David pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to her. "I want you to call my office on Monday morning. I think we need to have a conversation about a position in my company. Someone with your skills and your integrity shouldn't be serving coffee." He glanced back at Marcus with cold satisfaction. Clearly, some of us could learn a thing or two about recognizing talent when we see it. With that, David Brennan and his entire team walked out, leaving Marcus Chen and his lawyers sitting in the wreckage of their failed scheme. The merger was dead. The stock prices would plummet when news got out, and Marcus would spend years rebuilding his reputation from this disaster. He looked at Naomi with something between hatred and disbelief, unable to comprehend how his perfect plan had been destroyed by someone he had considered beneath his notice. Naomi set down the coffee pot carefully, her hands still shaking. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if David Brennan's offer was genuine or just a gesture made in the heat of the moment. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had spoken truth to power, and power had been forced to listen. For once in her life, being invisible had worked in her favor, because no one had thought to hide their secrets from someone they didn't consider important enough to matter. As she left the conference room and headed back to the service elevator, Naomi thought about her mother in the hospital, about the medical bills that never seemed to stop coming, about the college degrees sitting unused in a folder at home while she poured coffee for people who never said thank you. She thought about the look on Marcus Chen's face when his perfect plan fell apart, and the grudging respect in David Brennan's eyes when he realized he had been saved by the person he least expected. And she thought about what her grandmother used to tell her when she was a little girl. "Baby, don't ever let anyone make you feel small. You carry the wisdom of generations, and when the moment comes, you speak your truth loud and clear. Today, Naomi had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had changed the course of a billion-dollar deal and proven that power doesn't always sit at the head of a conference table. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner, watching and waiting until the moment when silence becomes impossible and speaking up becomes the only choice that matters. On Monday morning, Naomi Rivers sat in David Brennan's executive office on the 58th floor of the Brennan Building, a different tower in Manhattan with an even more spectacular view. She wore a professional navy suit she had bought years ago for job interviews, her hair styled, her confidence rebuilt after a weekend of processing what had happened. David sat across from her, his expression serious but warm, and beside him was Catherine Walsh, the lawyer who had almost caught Marcus's deception. "Ms. Rivers," David began, "I've spent the weekend thinking about what happened on Friday, and I've come to two conclusions. First, you have extraordinary skills that are being completely wasted. Second, my company needs people who have both intelligence and integrity, and you demonstrated both in a moment of extreme pressure." He leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "I'd like to offer you a position as a junior analyst in our International Business Development Division. The pay is $75,000 per year to start, with full benefits and the opportunity for rapid advancement based on performance." Naomi felt tears prick at her eyes but forced them back. $75,000. It was more than twice what she made serving coffee, enough to cover her mother's medical expenses and start rebuilding her savings. But more than the money, it was validation that her education and skills mattered, that she was more than the uniform she wore and the coffee pot she carried. "There's one condition," Catherine Walsh added, speaking for the first time. "We need you to help us understand international business practices, particularly in Asian markets. Your language skills and cultural knowledge are incredibly valuable, and frankly, we should have had someone like you on our team years ago." She smiled slightly. "If we had, we might have caught Marcus's trick before Friday." Naomi took a deep breath and nodded. "I accept. Thank you, both of you." She paused, then added quietly, "You should know that I didn't speak up on Friday because I expected anything in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do." David's expression softened. "I know, that's exactly why I wanted to hire you. In my experience, people who do the right thing when there's nothing in it for them are the people you want on your team when everything is on the line." He stood and extended his hand again. "Welcome to Worldwide Communications, Ms. Rivers. Something tells me this is the beginning of a very interesting career." As Naomi shook his hand and then Catherine's, she felt something shift inside her. The weight she had been carrying for months, the weight of invisibility, of frustrated potential, of dreams deferred, began to lift. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had proven that knowledge is power, that courage matters, and that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody bothered to notice. The story of what happened in Conference Room A on the 63rd floor of Apex Tower spread through Manhattan's business community like wildfire. The details were juicy and irresistible. A billionaire caught cheating, a merger destroyed, and most deliciously the fact that a catering staff member had been the one to expose the whole scheme. Some people called it karma. Others called it luck. A few cynics suggested it was staged, though no one could figure out why anyone would stage such a humiliating disaster for Marcus Chen. Marcus himself vanished from public life for 3 months after the incident. Chen Technologies' stock price dropped 12% when news of the failed merger broke, costing investors billions and costing Marcus his reputation as a brilliant dealmaker. Several board members called for his resignation. Business partners began reviewing old contracts, wondering what other clever clauses they might have missed. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into whether Marcus had violated disclosure laws, though ultimately they couldn't prove criminal intent. But the worst damage was to his ego. Marcus Chen had built his entire identity around being the smartest person in the room, the man who saw angles others missed, the negotiator who always won. And he had been outsmarted by someone he had never even considered a player in the game. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any financial loss, and it fundamentally changed how he approached business. He became more cautious, more transparent, and perhaps most importantly, more aware of the people around him. He started noticing the support staff, the assistants, the people whose names he had never bothered to learn. He started saying, "Thank you." Naomi's mother, Mrs. Claudette Rivers, was released from the hospital 6 weeks after Naomi started her new job. The cancer was in remission, the treatments had worked, and for the first time in years, both mother and daughter could breathe freely without the constant fear of medical bankruptcy hanging over their heads. Claudette insisted on visiting Naomi's new office, and when she saw her daughter's name on the door, Naomi Rivers, Junior Analyst, International Development, she cried, tears of pride and relief. "Your father would be so proud," Claudette whispered, holding Naomi's hand tightly. Naomi's father had died when she was 12, a construction accident that had left the family struggling. He had always told Naomi that education was the key to a better life, that she should never let anyone make her feel less than she was. "You did it, baby. You used that brilliant mind of yours, and you changed everything." Naomi thought about that moment in the conference room, when she had stepped forward and spoken words that powerful men didn't want to hear. She thought about the fear that had almost stopped her, the voice in her head that said it wasn't her place to speak, that she should stay invisible and safe. And she thought about what her father used to say, "Justice delayed is justice denied, and silence in the face of wrong is participation in that wrong." "I just told the truth, Mama," Naomi said softly. "That's all I did." "That's everything, baby," Claudette replied, squeezing her hand. "That's everything." 1 year later, Naomi Rivers was promoted to senior analyst and given her own team. She specialized in international mergers and acquisitions, and her reputation for spotting hidden problems in contracts became legendary in the industry. Companies began requesting her specifically to review deals, knowing that her eye for detail and her linguistic skills could prevent disasters. She negotiated partnerships in Tokyo, Shanghai, and Paris, and every time she sat at a conference table, she remembered what it felt like to be invisible. She never forgot. And because she never forgot, she made a point of treating every person in every room with respect and attention. She learned the names of security guards and cleaning staff. She said good morning to receptionists and thank you to waiters. She knew from personal experience that intelligence and talent existed everywhere, not just in corner offices and executive suites, and she refused to participate in a system that only valued people based on their titles and salaries. David Brennan watched Naomi's rise with satisfaction and a bit of pride. He had taken a chance on her because she had saved him from a terrible mistake, but she had proven herself 100 times over through her work. She was brilliant, ethical, and fearless, exactly the kind of leader his company needed. When Catherine Walsh announced her retirement, David didn't hesitate. He called Naomi into his office and offered her the position of Vice President of International Operations, a role that came with a seat on the company's executive board. "You changed everything that day," David told her as they stood by the window, looking out at Manhattan stretched below them like a glittering circuit board of ambition and possibility. "Not just the merger. You changed how I think about talent, about who deserves a seat at the table. You proved that the most important voice in the room might be the one that's been silent the longest." Naomi smiled, thinking back to that moment when she had stepped forward with a coffee pot in her hand and truth on her tongue. "I was only silent because no one asked me to speak," she said. "But I was always listening. I was always paying attention. And when the moment came, I was ready." That was the real lesson, she realized. Power wasn't about having the most money or the most impressive title. Power was about having knowledge, courage, and the willingness to use your voice when it mattered most. Naomi had been invisible in that conference room, but she had seen everything. And when she finally spoke, her words had carried the weight of truth, and truth was the most powerful force in any room.